All right. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so I am Ashley Powers Clark. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm I'm the proud leader of the Homeless Education Services Program, and I am excited to be presenting to you today. I have about 30 minutes of content, and then I think we have about 15 minutes or so after that for questions, just questions and discussion. So,
Ashley, can I interrupt you just 1 minute? Just some work I forgot to provide to the audience.
sure.
Folks, as we move along, and you have a question, could you put that question in the chat? And Carl is going to categorize all of those questions, and when we get to the end, he's going to prompt Ashley with those questions. If we can get through them all, then we can take them from the audience. But we'll start with that just to ensure that we get the questions focused and get them to our presenter as quickly as possible. Sorry for the interruption, Ashley.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate that process. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. So first off, who am I? My name is Ashley Powers Clark. My colonial credentials are a master's degree from UC Davis in community and youth development. I have a master's in social work from Sac State. I have a PPS and I'm working on my admin credential. Most importantly, I'm a mom to these two little girls you see on the screen, my 3-year-old who is Avalon and my 5-year-old who is Asa. A couple other things about me. As I've grown old, I turned 40 this year. So my mantra this year is to learn how to become an idealist, but be a discerning idealist. So how do we stay true to our highest values and visions while making sure that we are developing partnerships and programs that are right for our kids? And so I also took up roller skating at age 40. So that's another thing that's really important to know about me. If you see me in the neighborhood, you may see me with a lot of pads and on skates. And then part of my journey in coming to homeless education, I've been in the field of homeless education for about 12 years. I have been in my role as a homeless education services coordinator for, I actually think yesterday or 2 days ago was my 1-year work anniversary. And I really came to know homelessness through, through some lived experiences that I wish that I didn't have. So growing up, I had 2 siblings, both of whom, were really afflicted by mental health and substance abuse challenges. So, from my teens all the way up until, just a few years ago, really experienced, the impacts of homelessness within my immediate family. And so learned how to navigate these systems alongside my family members from a young age. And so really know some of the struggles, just from that perspective. And I'm also acutely aware of the fact that, those experiences were not because of the color of my skin, nor were they made worse by the color of my skin. And that is the difference that makes a difference for our children. So I want to get started. I want to spend some time just kind of talking about the context of homelessness in our city. Some of this context, I know I'll be preaching to the choir in terms of the broader political landscape, but I think it's really important to understand the kind of unique historical and political moment that we're experiencing around the crisis of homelessness in our city, because what is happening and what has happened in history and what is happening politically impacts the ways that our young people are showing up to school every day. So I'm going to take a minute to just kind of spell out some of those connections and how they impact, what a young person experiencing homelessness feels like when they step through the doors of a school. And then I'm grateful to Daryl because he laid out a very clear list of questions for you all. So then I'm going to get into those questions, understanding, the role of a homeless liaison. How do we go about identifying students who are experiencing homelessness in our schools? What kind of outreach do we do? What kind of services do we offer? And then lastly, what are the most pressing challenges that we see facing our program? Some possible solutions, and just ideas about how, if it makes sense, we might be able to work together going forward. Does that sound good to everybody?
Thanks a lot, Ashley. Yes.
All right, perfect, excellent. So I will start off just to really give you some context about what we are facing in terms of the crisis of homeless education honestly, across the state of California, but also in our district. So these three different circles have really what have created, I put a tornado in the middle because that is the image that comes up when I think about all of these different things that are really coming together and creating some circumstances that are pretty unfortunate for the state of homeless education, you know, in our district and across the whole state of California. So I'm going to really kind of touch on each one of these things, what's happening in terms of our decreased funding. When we think about policies, how our young people and families are facing criminalization like they have not seen before. And then all the while, some of the things that our team has done has really increased the number of homeless students that we are identifying. So we have, you know, really unfavorable policies that have been passed, decrease in funding, and then honestly 185% increase in the number of students that we've been serving. And all of that has happened just in the past year. So it has been quite a first year in the program. So these are just kind of the main points that I'm going to be hitting on throughout the presentation. So I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about, in terms of, I'm going to start with this piece of policy history and criminalization. So I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with our core value and guiding principle in our district about recognizing that our system is inequitable by design, working vigilantly to interrupt inequities and provide opportunities. So for me, when I look at this core value, it's important that we all really have a common understanding of what are the inequities in the system, where they come from, what's, you know, and being able to look at that and have a common understanding of where we're at in our city. So when we think about housing and we think about housing ownership, land ownership in our city, I look at the work of Dr. Jesus Hernandez. So he was a sociology professor out of Sac State. And he did some really incredible work looking at mortgage documents throughout the city. And so this is a map that basically shows all of the dark areas on this map, shows where there were racially restricted covenants evidenced in the mortgage documents of homeowners. And this was all the way up, you know, until 1945 in the present. So you can see here, black area, those areas that are in those darker colors are the places where we see people of color were not able to buy houses. The lighter shades are places where people were deficient in their mortgages. So when we think about this kind of broader history, which was not all that long ago, this right here is impacting what is happening with our unhoused students today. So this next map, it kind of maps perfectly on. Those blue dots are generally where we see more white residents. The green, red, and yellow dots are where we see more residents of color. So you can see all the way up until the present that the history that we have in our city has impacted where people get to live, where people get to own house, who gets to own houses, who gets to own land. It tracks perfectly onto poverty. So areas that are white, we see less poverty. Areas that are in those darker blues, we see more poverty. And then lastly, look at tree cover. So we can take an aerial view of our city and look at the areas that have more access to trees and green space. And that also maps perfectly onto the first map we showed. So when we start to look at this, some of the data that I pulled before the presentation was really trying to think about how is this impacting our Black students. So an important thing that when I was looking at some of our data was just to try to look at disproportionality in terms of our homeless population. And so when we look at our data, we see that Black students represent about 12% of 12% of students in the district, but they represent 34% of the students experiencing homelessness in our district. And when we look across any of our subgroups, any of our racial subgroups, there's no disproportionality like this. There's a little bit of disproportionality in terms of the number of students that are in special education, 17% of the district and about 21% of the homeless population. but this is by far the most striking disproportionality that we see in our data. So thinking about history is important and understanding how that impacts the data and the outcomes that we're seeing today. Another piece, just a quick show of hands. If we kind of roll back the calendar, think about where we were as a city a year ago. This was a very common scene in our city. I live really close to Stockton Boulevard, like about 2 blocks from Stockton Boulevard in Colonial Park. And I know, you know, when basically like there were basically encampments or communities of our unhoused neighbors all over the city, you know, in bus stops and traffic medians. And I think that about a year ago today, we had kind of reached this fevered pitch in our city where people emotions were very high about the problem and people were really upset about things. And at that point, what was happening is that the visibility of the homelessness crisis, which had always been there, was now just right in front of our faces. So a shift that we've seen in the city is this. So instead of homelessness being visible, we've basically taken homelessness because of some policies that have happened, and we've started to make homelessness invisible again, right? So this little traffic median right here on the left-hand side is basically, it's at the intersection of like 19th and Stockton. And there was this little traffic median, and for about 6 months, it had been this enormous community of unhoused neighbors that I'd pass every day on my way to work. And then once we had some of the camping bans passed here in the city, those communities were disabled and replaced with beautification projects, right? So this is what that area looks like. That's right across the street now. There's no encampments, but we do see, you know, we see boulders and cactuses and gardens springing up. And while in no stretch of the imagination do I want to paint the picture that, you know, our people in the city are working really hard on this issue. You know, I have been in the trenches working on this issue for a long time. But I do want to say that these policies have created a situation where we're forcing people back into invisibility. And we're also creating mobility. So we see now a lot of our unhoused neighbors, rather than living in community and encampments with one another, this is a really common scene, right? Where you see people having two, you know, grocery carts put together and are forced to kind of be constantly on the move and be constantly vigilant about who they are and where they can be. So the reason why this happened, we had the Supreme Court pass a decision called the Grants Pass decision. For the reason why homelessness had become so sort of visible in our city was because they're basically the rights that sort of protected those communities against sweeps. So we couldn't dismantle any of those encampments unless we could offer an alternative, right? Unless we could offer our unhoused neighbors shelter. And that was held up in the courts under the 8th Amendment, which protects people against cruel and unusual punishment. So that was kind of like the legislation that was holding that whole piece together. So that is why our city looked the way it did. The Supreme Court, however, passed upheld the Grants Pass decision, which basically overturned that decision that was held up in the federal courts and said it is not cruel and unusual punishment to sweep encampments, to cite our unhoused neighbors for essentially existing. And so now we are seeing a criminalization of homelessness like we haven't seen before in our city. And as a result, there's a lot of bias that has come out against our unhoused families. People saying things like this is their fault. They're never going to come to school anyway. Right after the decision, a politician in Southern California said, I'm warming up the bulldozer in relation to how that politician felt about homeless encampments. So I really want to paint this. I wanted to take the time to paint this picture for everyone because it's so important to understand what's happening outside the walls of our schools, because all of this legislation is forcing our unhoused families who feel shame and who feel that they need to keep their lives in secret anyways, this is creating a situation that makes all of those feelings and all of those stigmas worse. And what's even worse is that now we're criminalizing families, and we're criminalizing individuals for simply existing as people who do not have fair access to housing. And so all of this is impacting our students, and all of this is impacting our families, the way they see themselves and the way they feel when they show up at school. So I used to work at Oak Ridge Elementary School for about 5 years. I was a student support center coordinator, and it was a pretty familiar scene to see cars like this, show up in the parking lot, where it's pretty obvious just looking at the car that family had spent the night there, right? All of their possessions are kind of like up on the top. And one of the things that was always a miracle to me was that like the kids would show up and like they'd open the door, and then like a McDonald's cup would fall out of the car, and the kid would only have one shoe on, and you're sort of like, trying to get him out of the car and move the cars along. But the kids, like they would be smiling, and like they would still find an ability, even though sleeping in a car at night, like they were still able to show up to school and still able to show up, and oftentimes just like, be there in their joyful selves. And that was always just such a miracle to me. So I want to take a minute to
When I first started this whole
I'm going to take a minute. Can you hear my speakers? Am I able to share sound? Do you guys know? We'll give it a try. So I have about a 6-minute audio clip, and I want to take just a moment to really understand what it feels like to be a family that is in this situation. So we had the opportunity to produce some audio stories because it's very important for people to understand the lived experiences of homeless families. And so I want to take a minute and just kind of listen to some of those stories.
When I first started this whole homeless thing, I was mad at God. Like, why? What on God's green earth did I do wrong to deserve this? What did my kids do wrong to have to be like this? But in all reality, I'm not alone. There's other families doing the same thing.
Tiffany McDaniel is proud, and she loves her children. The 37-year-old has been homeless for 4 years. Tiffany and her husband, Scotty, had housing for themselves and their daughters, Bella, 9, Daniela, 14, and Ayana, 11. But then everything turned upside down.
4/13 in 2020, I showed up to find Isabella's dad murdered on the side of the road. I tell my landlord, I said, next month I'm not going to be paying all the rent or whatever. Can you work with me? He says no. And I was like, well, you know what? I can't pay the rent. I'm out of here. I left everything. Everything that I worked hard to get. My bedroom set, their bunk bed set, their clothes, their everything. Everything. We got in the car and left with what we had on our back. I went to the welfare office. They gave me so many days in the motel, and then I called them back and let them, hey, I'm still homeless out here. Well, there's nothing else we can do for you. I was able to stay like a total of 32 days in the motel. And then after that, moved back to my truck, and then I bought our motorhome. And so we had the motorhome. The canopy thing that goes out fell off. The door fell off. So now we just have the screen door. So I just parked my truck right against the screen door, and I let the kids go inside and sleep, and I'll sleep in the backseat of my truck.
With Tiffany, the challenges for the homeless services team were with consistency in attendance. It's not like Tiffany wanted to keep her kids out of school. She knew they were better off with the services that Oak Ridge Elementary offered. All 4 of them received grief counseling, remedial education services for the kids, even clothing and toothpaste, and a place to wash up.
It's hard trying to get to and from school being homeless. I don't want to send my kids to school dirty. I don't want to send my kids to school in dirty clothes or smelling funny. Like, that's not me.
My name is Alicia. I'm 49. I'll be 50 in a couple of weeks. In 2020, I was in a real bad car accident. August 1st of 2020. Before then, I was working, just self-sufficient, just self-sufficient. And I was hit by a drunk driver that left me in a coma for a whole month. Everything on my right side was broken.
Alicia's story to homelessness starts with that accident, but is enhanced by a series of systems failures.
For the car accident, I lived somewhere totally different. I lived upstairs in my apartment, my washer and dryer. I didn't know that I had moved until I was being released from the hospital. And I was like, hey, where are we at?
Let's reiterate that. Alicia didn't know she had been put in a housing program and her entire apartment had been moved until she showed up at her new apartment after being in a coma for a month. Later, that housing program shut down, and she and her 3 children, who are now 8, 10, and 12, lived in their car while she was still trying to get physical and cognitive therapy for her injuries. Now she and her children are in a homeless motel. With Alicia, the issue for homeless services was not making sure her kids were in school, but in finding them. It was the middle of the pandemic. Sacramento schools were on remote learning, and Alicia's kids just fell off the map.
The accident happened August 1st. And then I came home September. I was bedridden. So they missed September, October, November. And then it was around November when I had called the school and the school came out to my house.
The striking thing about this is that Alicia was in the system. She was in the hospital. She was in rehab. Someone followed through to make sure she had adequate first floor housing. The housing people even moved her. But no one contacted the school where her children were enrolled until Alicia recovered enough to do it herself. By that time, her children had missed almost an entire semester. Alicia also pointed out something else that is a huge barrier for Sacramento schools to find homeless youth. Parents are often afraid to tell schools they're homeless.
People will be nervous to even go to the school because they're thinking CPS or something. Are they going to take our kids? That's why when you told me your kids can't get taken off because you're homeless, I was like, really? Wow. People need to know that.
I have very unpresent parents because they are most definitely alive, most definitely around, but choose not to parent me. My name is Jenilyn. I am 19.
At first blush, Jenilyn doesn't fit the definition of a homeless student. She has always had a roof over her head, whether it was staying with relatives or friends, but she has been taking care of herself since her mother moved out when Jen was in 8th grade.
I don't know. I remember I became troubled and stuff like that. I would always be outside, and all my friends were seniors and had cars, and I was a freshman, so I would be with them. And I remember after she left, I was just staying at my friend's house for months and months, and people couldn't get a hold of me. People didn't really know what I was up to. My family, like I had numerous family members out there, but nobody ever cared.
Jenilyn found her solace in school, which she calls her happy place. Despite being homeless, despite the pandemic, Jenilyn managed to graduate in 2022. Now she is working to help other young people in Sacramento navigate systems she had to navigate by herself.
Like that, like I didn't think I was considered in that category. Like when I think homeless, I think the worst of the worst. You know, people are going through it worse than me. Like their peoples are probably cracked out and it's raining or whatever. They're under a bridge or they don't have food. They can't clean their clothes. But the reality of it is, if you're not with your parents, you're homeless, period.
All right, so thanks everybody just for taking a moment to just sit with the stories and sit with the experiences of 2 families and 1 unaccompanied youth in our district. So with that in mind, I think the question that is kind of before all of us, given the picture I was able to paint, is how do we make sure that our schools are safe havens for our unhoused students? Something we've pride ourselves as a district is that when particular groups of students are under attack, that schools become a place of safety and security. And so when we think about what our homeless students experiencing homelessness are facing, we have to consider it within that same context. And I think consider it within the same sort of mandate that we have put out for ourselves as who we are and who we want to be. So just like this idea of safe haven came about when we started to see some of the immigration policies of the Trump administration, we said our schools would be safe for our students who are undocumented. Same when we see our LGBTQAI plus students under attack. So now's the time to really think about, now's the time to really think about how do we make sure schools are not only safe and welcoming for all of our unhoused students, but we actually lift up some of the expectations, because we know that our students want to do more than survive. right? And students will rise to the level of expectations and beliefs that we have for them. So not only do we want safety and security for all of our unhoused students, we also want to raise the expectations about what our unhoused students are capable of and what we working together can do for those students. So with that in mind, I'm going to transition to kind of the more technical portions of the presentation, which sort of lay out some of the legislation, the federal mandates that we're held accountable to as a school district. So the McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Assistance Act is a federal piece of legislation that started in the mid-80s. And is what all states are held accountable to for in terms of identifying, outreaching, and serving students experiencing homelessness. So the McKinney-Vento Act defines homelessness as lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So that's the overarching definition. And there's certain categories of that definition that students can fit into. One is sharing housing due to, it could be economic hardship. It could be you lost your housing because of a fire and now you're doubled up with grandma. Being doubled up is the largest category that we have. So the majority of our students who are unhoused, about 75% fit into that category. Students residing in hotels, motels, trailers that are unfit for habitation, not necessarily trailer parks, shelters, private or public spaces not designed for human habitation, cars, parks, abandoned buildings, or similar settings. And then last and extremely important category is our unaccompanied youth. So this is young people that are not living in the care of their parents, that are also not in the foster system. So if you are kicked out of your parents' house, if your parents are unable to care for you and you're couch surfing with all your friends, and it is not an agreement. So if mom and dad say, hey, it's better if you go live with your aunt right now, that doesn't count. It is if students have absolutely no other choice and no other place to go. So that's another category that fits in terms of our students experiencing homelessness. And so so every school district is mandated, every school district across the whole country is mandated to have a homeless education liaison, which is the role that I play in the school district. And these are the things that, in terms of the legislation, that the homeless liaison is responsible for ensuring. So identification of homeless students, making sure that they have access to immediate enrollment. That means you need no documents. So you should be able to show up in the enrollment center and get enrolled in school with that day. SCUSD defines that as 24 hours. So immediate enrollment is 24 hours, no questions asked. School stability, so making sure that students have the right to stay at their school of origin, meaning if you are unhoused so say you're living in the Oak Ridge attendance area, you lose your housing and now you are staying, I don't know, in John Cabrillo's attendance area, you have the right to stay at Oak Ridge, or you have the right to enroll in John Cabrillo, or you have the right to attend a school that is in your best interest. So if you lost your housing and you're over in the John Cabrillo area and mom has to get up for work at 5 o'clock in the morning and the only people that can take care of you are grandma who is living in Joan Didion's attendance area, you also have the right to attend that school. So school stability and school placement is something that the liaison in our program is responsible for. Transportation, we're also mandated to provide transportation to your school of origin or your best interest placement, access to preschool programs, access to academic and extracurricular activities, free meals, removing barriers to enrollment, coordinating research, and making sure parents and students know their rights. So these are the categories of things that are written out in the legislation that says what the liaison has to do. So our team is really responsible for making sure that these things happen by working in partnership with our school sites. Our team is a small but mighty team. We have 3 social workers and 3 youth and mental health advocates. We work regionally, so we have a team of an advocate and a social worker in the north area, central area, and south area. Then it is myself, our clerk, and we do have a network of community partners that we also work with. So that's how our program is structured. And then I wanted to just highlight this too, because there are, in addition to what's laid out in the legislation, we also have certain legislation that was passed at the state level that kind of strengthens that federal legislation. So again, they have really important things are that they have priority enrollment in expanded learning programs and intercession programs. They should have priority enrollment in specialty programs, the right to fee waivers, the right to self-determination on their FAFSA applications. So these are just kind of a shorter list of the rights that our children and youth have. So this is a really important thing for us to all keep in mind. So when we look at outcomes for our students experiencing homelessness in the district, these are three really important ones up here on the infographic. And I'll dive a little bit into these as in the next section of the presentation. So it is likely that there is at least 3,100 students experiencing homelessness in the district. That number comes from, statistically, about 10% of your free and reduced price lunch population should also qualify as homeless under McKinney-Vento. So the bar that we set for ourselves in terms of being like, okay, I think we're actually identifying sort of a critical mass of students is 3,100, because that is 10% of our free and reduced price lunch population. I will say that that's like a statistical average across the whole country. In areas like Sacramento, where we're at the epicenter of the homelessness crisis, I personally think it's closer to like 20 or 25% of our free and reduced price lunch population, but right now that's the bar we're trying to get to. And we've identified about 1,700. So just a little more than half of those students have been identified in our system. Of those students, about 19.3% of our general population is chronically absent. 70% of our students experiencing homelessness are chronically absent. And then a real call to action here is our graduation rates are 85% district-wide, and yet they are 60% for our students experiencing homelessness. This is below the statewide average for students experiencing homelessness. Statewide, the average is 68%. Here in our district, we're only at 60%, which is just a slight increase from last year. Last year, we were at 55. So this graph, some of the things that we've been able to do with some of the resources that have been just recently invested in the homeless education services team. For about 30 years in our district, there was one person, a coordinator and a clerk, and that was really the only people that were responsible for implementing all that was in the legislation. And so you can imagine, as only, being one person, it was pretty difficult to get all those things done. But you can see here that we've done a lot better in terms of getting our students identified and in the system. So the orange bar in this graph represents the number of homeless students that were identified. The gray bar represents 10% of our free and reduced price lunch population that year. So you can see back in 2021, we had 482. We had 2 staff members in 2021-22. We had a full team that started working in 22-23, so we got almost up to about 1,000. And then from last year to this year, we've jumped up to about 1,700. And again, that number is increasing every day. So that was just the last time I pulled the data when I made this. So we have done better in terms of identification, and we have a long way to go. So one of the questions that Daryl said that the group had was, how are students identified? So per our McKinney-Vento legislation, every student who is identified as homeless has to complete a housing survey. So this is a state mandated survey. Basically, the student just has to put their name, their school. They check one of these 4 boxes on the side here that says what describes your living situation, who is living in your household, and then staff can submit the survey for families. Families can submit it themselves. we have to have one of these surveys on file in order to count you as unhoused, code you in our student information system, which then gives you access to the rights and services that I have described. So this housing survey is part of what has really helped us with identification. Identification is something that we are constantly working on. And so I want to paint for you just kind of some of the changes that we made in the last year that helped to show that kind of large increase in our numbers. So one of the things that we have tried to do is we want to take this housing survey and put it into every single application that parents might fill out across the entire district. So how do we make sure wherever parents are going to update their information, they're also updating their housing status? So one of the main ways that we get referrals is through applications from the enrollment center. So when you initially come to the district, if you mark that you're in any of those living situations, that gets sent to our department, and I'll talk about how we notify and serve students afterwards. We have the biannual update that we're starting to push out. So parents are encouraged to update their information in the student information system twice a year. A huge thing that we've done is put the question in the expanded learning application. So when people register for after school, they're also answering that question. And then they expanded learning shares their data with us. We are just barely starting an online survey so that school staff, parents, and young people can identify themselves. So it used to be that only staff members would submit a survey or if parents were filling out an application. So we're creating a way for families to be able to self-identify so that they don't have to disclose that information to a staff member if they do not want to. And then we get a lot of referrals from our shelters and our outside organizations as well. So we have really close relationships with the shelters and the motel voucher programs to try to make sure that we're identifying students. After a student is identified, we send out a notification email. So this notification email goes out to anyone at the school campus who needs to know this information to be able to do their job. So that means that we have principals need to know this information, office managers need to know this information, because office managers are the ones that we need to make sure that they know that students are unhoused so they do not disenroll them. Academic counselors need to know this information so that if students are unhoused, that they can qualify for reduced graduation credits or FAFSA waivers. Social workers and student support center staff. So those are people that have all been trained in terms of confidentiality and understand that this is very sensitive information, but they also need that information to do their job. So staff at the school sites are immediately notified. And this is a campaign that we started to develop with communications that we're just kind of getting the ball rolling on. So we developed these posters and honestly some messaging that is a little bit more positive and normalizing so that families can click on a QR code and submit a housing survey themselves. This is a poster that we've developed that we're going to work on getting to all of our high schools just to and honest, it's sad that we have to normalize homelessness, but if we don't normalize it and say, you know, hey, maybe about 10% of students at this school are going to experience some type of housing instability, right? And they may look exactly like the person that you see on this flyer. So this is and we made a special website for our young people to be able to check that has resources on it as well. So this is a campaign that we're working on to kind of address the issue of self-referrals and also address the issue of stigma. And then the same thing with families. So we're working on getting some new posters and messaging out there for families to be able to self-identify. In addition, our student support center staff uses a data system that allows them to pull data on their unhoused students. So this is just a screenshot of the data system that we use. You can see I highlighted homeless in yellow or in blue. So our student support center staff at our school sites are we work hand in hand with our student support centers at school sites who are also pulling lists of homeless students, looking at attendance, behavior, and grades, and working with their school site teams to outreach to see what their needs are. And then we work in partnership with school sites. So if school sites need our support, we have a referral form and they can refer students to us. So that is and we also send, every time we get a new student identified, I also send an automated text to that family. And so the family gets a message with their rights via text message, and they also receive our phone number if they want to reach out. So that's how students are identified, and that's a bit how we provide services and outreach. Now the question is, what services do we provide? So homeless education services, we really act as sort of a hub of programs and support for unhoused children and youth. First and foremost, we're responsible for implementing what is set out in the legislation. So a huge thing that we do is our school enrollment and placement support. We also provide bus passes and transportation support, food access and basic needs programs, tutoring services. We do not provide housing, though we can provide referrals to where families can go to try to get more information and connected to housing. And then one of the things that I'm most passionate about, especially this year, is really building programs and initiatives that can disrupt cycles of homelessness. So basic needs, we have built over the course of many years. This was a program that started during COVID. And actually in my driveway, we started delivering boxes to families, and the program has expanded, and now we have a full-on food access center at the Cerna Center. So we work with all of the partners that you see here. The Central Kitchen, we have a full-time food access center coordinator funded through a No Kid Hungry grant that is implemented by Alchemist Community Development Corporation. After many years of advocacy, we are now a food bank partner. So we receive shipments of food directly from the food bank. And one of the things our team has started implementing is, traditional food banks are not really set up to serve families experiencing homelessness. So we've developed customized food boxes depending on your living situation. So if you just have a microwave, we have a specific food box we can give you. If you're living in a car and you have no access to any cooking facilities, we have specific food that we can give you. So we're really trying to customize the way that we provide support, and honestly just elevate the level of food and nutrition we're able to offer people. And that is an incredible program that is run in partnership with Alchemist Community Development Corporation. And then of course we have our basic needs and crisis response. So we've got a clothing closet, hygiene items, backpacks, shoes. Those are all things that are coming in that we are giving out constantly. So that all comes from our educational services team. We send that stuff out through requests from school sites, usually in the inter-district mail, or school staff can come directly to us and pick up the things that they need. And then I think the more important thing, it's wonderful that we're doing all of the basic needs and getting our kids enrolled in school. But the thing that we all really need to be looking at is how are we interrupting these cycles of homelessness? So youth without a high school diploma are 4.5 times more likely to experience homelessness later in life. And if you don't complete high school, it's the single greatest risk factor for homelessness later in life. And so think about this, and then we think about that in the context of only 60% of our students experiencing homelessness graduating high school. And one of the things, in addition to everything else, our team is really trying to spearhead is how do we actually start to interrupt some of these cycles? So we work extremely closely with all of the different departments at Cerna. So youth development, college and career, we're starting partnerships with community schools, our department, community organizations, and school sites to really look at all the assets and resources and ask ourselves some critical questions about what do we have already and how is that being targeted to our most vulnerable students. Because at the middle, we have to believe that all of our students experiencing homelessness also need to graduate with the greatest array of post-secondary choices. So we really, really need to elevate kind of how we're thinking about this work. And so one of the things that we've learned about recently is just the power of CTE, or college and career technical education. So Jacqueline and I were at a conference, I think it was back in May of last year, and we saw this slide. And I think both of our jaws dropped. We were like, wait a minute, students who participate in CTE have a 96% graduation rate compared to a 68% graduation rate. So learning about the power of CTE and how it can protect and impact our unhoused students, which is our college and career technical education. So that means like our pathways of support, our health education pathways, our automotive pathways, our law academy, our ROTC. It is the single most powerful thing we can do for our students. So we've really started to focus on that. We developed a pilot program over the summer that provided some access to career technical education and academic support. We really built the plane as we were flying it. So we pulled the program together in about 6 weeks in partnership with Youth Development and Youth Forward. And we saw that by offering some of these more strategic and targeted interventions, we were able to take 27 youth experiencing homelessness and help them recover 370 credits in under a month. So we look at pilot programs like this and we can tell ourselves that, like, yes, it is possible. It is possible to do better. And it is possible that when we get the right people working together, we can have an impact on these larger outcomes. And then last but not least, we have been taking, working with our communications and really taking every opportunity we can to outreach and advocate within the community so that everybody understands this crisis. Everybody understands the rights of our homeless students, and everybody understands what they can do to support. And so lastly, I'm going to wrap it up here with just some challenges and possible resolutions. So decreased funding was the thing that was one of those little things I showed you at the beginning in the circle. So we have a lean staff. We have 7 people on our team. So 4 of the positions in our program are funded by COVID dollars. So that means of the team that is doing some of this, that is spearheading this incredible work, we could be losing 4 of them. So that would bring our team down to 3 people. We've had a decrease in our operations funding by about 87%. Our COVID funding expired at the end of September, so we've had an 87% decrease in funding, in operations funding, and 185% increase in identification. Additionally, we work hand in hand with student support centers at school sites, and 40% of our social workers and mental health staff in our department are funded by COVID dollars. So that means the partners that we rely on at the school sites are also, their positions are also kind of up in the air. And so right now our operating budget we have a $79,000 competitive federal grant as our total operating budget for the year. One of the biggest challenges that we are finding is the students' right to immediate enrollment. So that has been a real challenge with the online systems delays and application windows. And then the last part, when we look at policy, so students experiencing homelessness are not a subgroup in policies. So what that means is, like, when we think about our local control funding formula, we have low-income students, EL students, and foster students. Homeless students are not a subgroup. So they're just considered, they're lumped in together with low socioeconomic students. However, homeless students graduate at a 12% less rate than low socioeconomic students. And so what's difficult about not being a subgroup is that you do not have the same visibility, you don't have the same accountability. And so that's something that I have realized is a big issue for us. And so we just don't have that systems for prioritizations and accountability to really call out and serve our students experiencing homelessness. And that goes from policies that start at the state level, right, all the way down to the local level. Some things we could do is just really looking at, like, what are our per pupil allocations for students experiencing homelessness? How can we protect some of these positions? Our staff provide some really unique services. So how do we protect those positions? Enrollment, can we identify and remove all the barriers to enrollment immediately? And then just making students experiencing homelessness a subgroup. So develop specific accountability measures, funding, and services, and assure that these things can be put in place. So those are just some of like the really high level sort of ideas and threats that I have out there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there, you know, based on, you know, discussion and interest, there's hopefully some ways that we can work together, you know, to help advocate, make sure families understand their rights, help people get connected to, we have a lot of different opportunities. So we accept donations, volunteer opportunities to pack food boxes, deliver items, you know, deodorant, shampoo, kits, now all that's, we cannot keep stuff on the shelves long enough. So there's also opportunities to volunteer, there's opportunities to donate. Really, you know, it's an all hands on deck approach. So yeah, that was a tremendous amount of information. So I'm ready. So I'm going to go ahead and say that that's the end of what I have prepared for you. And thank you everybody for your attention. And I'm happy to transition and take any questions or comments people have.